This is the Breaker.news podcast for the week of September 29th, 2024. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of the Breaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 362. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And on the Big Deal feature, the MMA panel returns to put local, provincial, and federal trends under the microscope with Research Co.'s Mario Canseco and Simon Fraser University's Andy Yan. And Burnaby lawyer Mark Barry on his bid to keep the Law Society of BC factual about the potential burial site at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. We're here at the end of September, early on in the BC provincial election campaign, and joining me as usual for the quarterly look back at what happened and look ahead at what's going to happen, Mario Canseco, president of Research Co., and Andy Yan, the director of the City program at Simon Fraser University. Together, we're the MMA panel. I'm Mackin, there's Mario, and there's Andy, the M and the M and the A. And here we are, end of September, in the middle of the provincial election. And one of the biggest political stories in BC history happened in the quarter at the end of August. Kevin Falcon, he pulled BC United, the former BC Liberals, out of the election, out of the October 19th election campaign. Yet it was a wedding that was more like a divorce. I think that's what you said, Mario, when it happened. Making John Rustad the de facto leader of the free enterprise vote for the Conservatives against David Eby, Premier David Eby, for the Democratic Socialist NDP. It sets up, as Mario has said before, something that we've seen traditionally here in BC. Back in the old days of the Soak Reds versus the NDP, the Greens, of course, are a distant third. Here we are on the way to October 19th, and we've had some flip-flops. The carbon tax, involuntary care for addicts and mentally ill. David Eby has adopted conservative-style positions on those issues. Yet, we do have an interesting wild card. There's 72 ridings with new boundaries. So, first of all, I just want to ask you guys what you think of the campaign so far. We haven't had enough talk about issues. We've had some policy planks here and there, but we've had a lot of weirdness with the NDP pointing out some of the quality control, let's say it, when it comes to some of the Conservative candidates and some of the things that John Rustad has said over the years at various conferences and also in web conferences. Mario, what are your thoughts on this whole campaign?
It's been pretty interesting to watch in the early stages. I think you're right. The policy has been lacking. It's been mostly an exercise in trying to steer your base towards you and not make the other guy attractive. Most of the efforts related to the criticism either of David Eby's change of policies or of John Rustad's personality and speeches from the past are designed to keep your base. Don't think that change is something that you require, or if you're somebody who's just coming into the Conservatives, you will be better off with us than if you go somewhere else. That might change in the next few weeks, of course, as we get closer to the election. But it's been, in my view, a situation that is more almost like an American primary, not even the real campaign. It's been more, personality of the other individual who's running for premier is not something that you should trust because he changed his mind or he said something about population control because of vaccines. So it's been almost like a primary, that the fight has not been about policy or about the future of the province. It's been about what the other person said and why you can trust them. And hopefully we'll get into something that is beefier and more interesting for voters in the latter stages of the campaign, because this is essentially an exercise that also shows us how much we've changed. I go back to the elections of 2005, 2009, when anything you said on social media meant automatic disqualification. Now the generation that grew up with social media is looking at some of these things and saying, oh, it's okay. Maybe I said something like that at one point, and it's not something that is going to be conducive to destroying your own political career. So, to borrow something that happened in the media landscape, when Hugh Grant went on Jay Leno to discuss his foibles in Hollywood Boulevard in the 1990s, a lot of people thought his career would be over. Because that's what happened to people in that position 20, 30, 40 years earlier. We are at that stage now where whatever you say on social media is not going to be used against you.
Yeah, I find it interesting how they have really hyped up John Rustad's vaccine hesitancy comments.
Right.
We're waiting to get the next shipment of the latest COVID vaccine that is available right now in Washington State. So if you're a British Columbian and you want to get vaccinated now with the latest formula to guard yourself against COVID as it swirls around this fall, you got to go down to Washington State. So that's a bit of a strike against the NDP. Of course, they've been really pushing this whole video showing John Rustad essentially saying that he doesn't think kids should be eating bugs. Well, we do have a factory in Ontario that does grow crickets for both human and animal consumption. And there are scientists at UBC who are studying this. Andy, and you're a foodie. Will this make any difference, or is this just the NDP, which I find interesting? The NDP is the party that would probably cater more towards vegetarians and vegans, and people that might actually appreciate the taste of bugs and the lower carbon footprint of bugs.
Well, bugs haven't necessarily hit my plates yet, and it's on the list. I think that there's a wonderful tradition of eating crickets in many different cultures. I heard that there's a wonderful tacos made out of made from grasshoppers. So I look forward to my next trip to not only Mexico but Southern California to kind of give chalopes. I believe it's called chalopes. I hope I got it right. A taste, but I think that underlying all this, and this is touching upon what Mario had talked about, was really how that social media generation isn't only looking at what's happening on the interwebs, they're looking for a home. And really how many people are looking for a home, and how that is really the core issue, is how housing has kind of pretty much dominated everything. But yet at the same time, with any number of promises from either party or all three parties, but yet the details are missing. That I think that there are, key kind of questions, that are still really lacking in terms of details, in terms of really what does each party intend in terms of paying for their respective programs, much less building homes, through which there are still ongoing challenges in terms of labor and materials. So I think that it's been, an election through which is a hell of a lot more interesting now than it was, say, 3 months ago. That, 3 months ago, it looked pretty good towards a very, very solid NDP majority. Now, I think it's a bit more ambiguous. I think that it's really in terms of, just the kind of moves in terms of what's happening on the right, but then also I think that what's underlying all this, for me, that's the most interesting aspect of it, is how 72 ridings actually have seen changes. That in certain cases they're minor changes, and others they're ones that I think really could swing in terms of the idea. And I was thinking about this because I was also looking at my RSP, that past performance may not be an indication of future outcomes. And that has pretty much underpinned my entire financial history. But then at the same time, the question about BC politics, is really interesting, given these kind of changes in 72 ridings. I think that a lot of I actually originally was going to look at just the new ridings, but then now the realization that that 72 ridings saw these kinds of changes. And remember, these changes are mandated by Elections BC, by legislation to reflect changes in the ridings. And certain ridings have actually shrunk, while most ridings have certainly grown. And you think about the ones in the Fraser Valley, the ones south of the Fraser, all of that has kind of represented the kind of growth. And certainly I think what that could mean towards the changing political culture in these ridings, which perhaps voted one way could also vote the other, And now I think many races that were perhaps in the bag, say last election, could be certainly in play in this one. So I think a lot to talk about, a lot to kind of think about, but I think in one way it kind of makes life kind of interesting and spicy.
Surrey, of course, is a battleground. It has 10 ridings this time around. Funny enough, though, this week, as we switched towards a bit of a civic focus, it was Doug McCallum, the former mayor of Surrey, not Brenda Locke, the current mayor, who defeated Doug McCallum in 2022. Doug McCallum making some headlines. He issued a wish list from his Safe Surrey coalition. He wants a whole bunch of things, more lanes on bridges, more SkyTrain, and he also still wants that 60,000 seat stadium in Fleetwood. And then the same week, here in Vancouver, you've got Mayor Ken Sim and his ABC Supermajority Caucus taking a step back. They no longer want to shut down the Integrity Commissioner's office. They say that they've been humbled. They've heard what the people have said, and the people wanted to keep the Integrity Commissioner.
Well, you also have to throw in the Parks Board in Vancouver. That really the kinds of passions that have now been inflamed about what is normally a part of civic government that people kind of go, where's my park? Or, why didn't they mow the grass on my park? That has actually really kind of, I think, really lit the fires in terms of what's happening civically. But yet, you're right, is that in the middle of a provincial election, we have all these civic issues come out from the two largest cities in British Columbia. And one wonders if it's because of how, if you will, the NDP was the first to cross the streams in terms of entering the realm of provinces, entering the operations of municipalities, that now it has begun to mix at that municipal mayors now themselves realize that, hey, I might as well put this right on the provincial agenda now, that while the political irons are hot there, that we have these two major communities in British Columbia lay out issues during a provincial election, saying that, hey, province, pay attention to this as much as everything else in the province of British Columbia.
Well, I think we'll get a sense of where the public stands on ABC if Christine Boyle wins her seat. And then we need to have a by-election for council. I think that will be the first opportunity to see whether people are actually really upset with the governance that we see from Ken Sim and the ABC Council, or whether this is just something that is bothering a relatively small number of people who are significantly loud. That is going to be the first test. The whole McCallum thing is quite bizarre. I just don't imagine a scenario where in 2019, somebody like Gregor Robertson comes out and says, this is what I want to see the federal government doing, or how we would feel if, for instance, Kennedy Stewart came out tomorrow with a list of things that he wants to see happening. It's the kind of thing that it's not really your jurisdiction unless you're the one who is running that city. And it's really strange to look at this, because it might be almost the first salvo in the next municipal election from the Safe Surrey Coalition, if and when Doug McCallum gets there. But it definitely is an attempt to try to take the air out. And it really shows just how much this election has become a karaoke bar. You look at the way in which people react to the Olympics, and you always have this situation where somebody's watching the 100-meter dash and thinking, well, I could run 100 meters in 10 seconds. We're having a little bit of that with people out of nowhere coming out as independent candidates, begging for signatures on Twitter to see if they can get to 75, asking for advice to see if they can find a financial agent. This is not what a democratic election should look like necessarily. I mean, if you want to have your name on the ballot, you got to start working on that 4 years prior to the deadline.
Switch over to the federal focus. Justin Trudeau's popularity, well, it didn't get any better during the summer. However, he went to New York City for the United Nations General Assembly, and his handlers made sure he went on the Late Night with Stephen Colbert, because it's not good enough to be big in Canada. If you're big in the US, well, you're really big in Canada. Mario, what do you think of that? Was that a good idea for Trudeau to go on late night TV?
I think one thing that conservative handlers have in common provincially and federally is just how much they want to be American. So this is a way in which you actually play into their the type of jealousy that can develop. I think they would have been very happy if Pierre Poilievre had been invited even to a talk show that's on syndication, because they love to have that angle of Canada versus the United States. The fact that Trudeau was on Colbert certainly drives them nuts, and there's an opportunity for them to say, "Oh, it doesn't really matter. He's not appealing to voters who are going to be casting ballots anyway. It was a very friendly interview, and he said some things that weren't justified." That's fine, but I think part of this is also Justin Trudeau figuring out what happens after he is prime minister, and there's a long line of statesmen from other countries who suddenly find a very nice audience in the United States, particularly in some Ivy League universities, to do and continue with their lives. And maybe this is part of it. He wants to become part of the zeitgeist in the United States. We know that he's definitely well liked in other areas of the world. People who haven't probably been made aware of just how unpopular he has become in Canada. And I don't think it was necessarily an audition for Justin Trudeau to the Canadian people. I think it was an audition of Justin Trudeau with the American people, and see if, when his term comes to an end, if he decides to retire, if he's defeated in the next election, can he go to the United States and essentially start an academic career? Lots of other people have done it.
Or start a late night talk show career.
That would work.
I think, Mary, you're right. Is that I think about Kim Campbell at Harvard. Like Kim Campbell, I think, was a Harvard Law School for a while, and I think that kind of handles that kind of tradition. But I mean, mind you, that being said, about Canadians being in the United States, then coming back to kind of on that new front of popularity, running for prime minister. You may have something here, Bob. I see Ryan Reynolds, 2028. Ryan Reynolds, good old Vancouver boy here, running for prime minister. I think that if that pattern holds, then perhaps we might see a Prime Minister Ryan Reynolds coming up. But I think that being said, I think that there is, what looks like some serious challenges for the Liberals in terms of what's happening in terms of the popularity of Justin Trudeau. But then I think what's more, I think, really is the effect of what's happening in the United States to Canadian politics is the switch in the head of the party all of a sudden, and yet a path to victory, as per with what happened with Joe Biden, with Kamala Harris, that if Kamala Harris wins, I think the days of Justin Trudeau might be numbered by the fact that she wins, and then being able to kind of change it literally within months of an American presidential campaign, that to show that yes, they can, may perhaps provide some sizable challenges for Justin Trudeau in the coming months.
You don't think there could be a possibility of a Prime Minister Seth Rogen?
Oh, that's right. That's right. There could be a Seth Rogen. I think that could be perhaps be in the cards here. So I think that there are some possibilities here.
Well, I mean, if he wants to take some time off his acting career, I think there could be a vacancy in the NDP eventually. We saw what happened with Jagmeet Singh. That was the other big political news recently, when he ended the confidence and supply agreement with the Liberals, with the Trudeau Liberals. He didn't join Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives in voting non-confidence, however, but the Singh NDP no longer is attached at the hip to the Liberals, yet there is unlikely to be an election this fall, of course, because the NDP is very focused on trying to hold on to BC, and there's only so much money to go around when it comes to donors, and so many volunteers to go around too. But Mario Canseco, what do you think of the future of Jagmeet Singh and the NDP on the federal side?
Extremely complicated. I think part of what we have is for a while, it was similar and reminiscent to the early days of the Jack Layton leadership. People telling us consistently, I really like Jagmeet Singh. I think he would make a fine babysitter, a person who I would like to have a beer with, somebody who I would trust to drive my car, but I'm not going to vote for the NDP. And this is the same way in which Jack Layton's first couple of elections unfolded until 2011, when the weakness of Michael Ignatieff suddenly allows the center-left vote to coalesce around Jack Layton, who did very well in Quebec, and they end up forming the official opposition. This time it's different, because I don't see a situation where people are going to be flocking necessarily from the Liberals to the NDP with somebody who is prime minister. I think part of what happened in 2011 was more a reaction of, well, if we want to defeat Harper, we might as well back a different horse, because the last couple of times things haven't gone our way. And it's going to be very, very tough to hold on to the seats that they have, particularly here in BC. I mean, we're at a situation where the Conservatives federally are polling at 50% in BC. These are numbers that Stephen Harper never got. We got to go back to the election of 2000 under the Canadian Alliance with Stockwell Day to find that level of support in an election for a federal party here in British Columbia. So you know you're going to be losing some of the seats here. You know that Ontario is going pretty heavily for the Conservatives, so the map isn't in your favor. And it really speaks about the need for renewal. You know, some of the things that we've seen, particularly in Alberta, with the renaissance that the Conservative movement has had after they decided to get their act together and join each other and create the United Conservative Party. It might be time to start to consider something like that at the federal level. Something well-crafted, not the bizarre exercise in exiting stage left that we saw with Kevin Falcon on the 28th of August.
Mm-hmm.
Mario Canseco, president of Research Co., and Andy Yan, the director of the City program at Simon Fraser University. Together, we're the MMA Panel. I'm Mackin. There's Mario, and there's Andy, the M and the M and the A. The Law Society of British Columbia's mandatory training material for lawyers about Indigenous culture remains unchanged. It still says an unmarked burial site contains the bodies of 215 children on the former Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds. At the September 24th annual general meeting, two lawyers, James Heller and Mark Berry, sought to change the wording to, quote, discovery of a potentially unmarked burial site, end quote. Just a few words, but plenty of controversy. Rewind to May 27, 2021. The Kamloops First Nation shocked the world with their original announcement, claiming the remains of 215 children had been found by ground-penetrating radar. It led to the declaration of September 30th as the annual National Truth and Reconciliation Day. But more than 3 years later, the Kamloops have an agreement with the Catholic Church, yet the site has not been excavated. The Kamloops First Nation now says 215 anomalies were detected. Will we ever get answers to vital questions? Were abused, neglected, or murdered children buried there? Is anyone alive who witnessed a crime or committed a crime? Just so listeners know, I take the abuse of children seriously. I graduated from a Catholic high school operated by the Christian Brothers called Vancouver College. Several of the teachers who were members of the Christian Brothers were tried and jailed for abusing children under their care in Newfoundland. If you are a residential school survivor in crisis, someone is available to speak with you now, anytime, at 1-866-925-4419. That's 1-866-925-4419. And if you think a child or youth under age 19 is being abused or neglected, you have the legal duty to report your concern to a child protection worker. Phone 1-800-663-9122. That's 1-800-663-9122 anytime. My guest is Mark Berry, who is a lawyer in Burnaby, who is one of the two lawyers who made this motion to the Law Society of British Columbia at its annual meeting. Mark, first of all, what was the result of the vote on September 24th, and why did you do this?
Well, the result was 1,499 lawyers in favor of the motion, 1,683 against, and there were 590 abstentions. In terms of why we did this, the Coles Notes answer is that we believe that for the legal profession, for sure, if there's going to be mandatory training for anyone who wishes to practice law in the province of British Columbia, with respect to any topic, that the training should be as factually accurate as possible. And in particular, when clear factual inaccuracies are identified, they should be corrected. You're never going to have it perfect. There are always going to be things that need to be edited. The world changes, situations change. And if we're doing it right, materials should be updated on a regular basis. But when a specific point is made that there's something here that's just clearly not right, it ought to be fixed. And the reason we moved to the resolution stage is that my co-mover, Mr. Heller, had emailed the Law Society 3 times. The first 2 times they ignored him. The third time, someone put an auto response on that said, "We'll get back to you, I think, in a couple of days." They never did. And up to and including today, the Law Society has still declined to make the change. So in the face of them apparently saying, we've seen what you've said about it being inaccurate, we declined to make any change about it. It was in the face of that we decided, well, there is a resolution process. Let's see what the membership thinks. Let's see what other lawyers think. Do other lawyers think this change should be made or not? And so that's why we did it.
Now, you had some evidence in your favor that you attached to the motion. There was a BC Court of Appeal decision from July written by Justice Marchand, who just happens to be someone from the Interior, who is also the first Aboriginal Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal in BC.
What we had in terms of the evidence was that, and I want to be clear, the change that we wish to make was limited to the wording in the course right now says that remains were discovered in Kamloops, and remains have not been discovered in Kamloops. And so what we asked was simply that the word potential be inserted. So the motion didn't even give an opinion as to whether or not remains are or aren't there. It just simply said, look, the accurate reflection of the current situation is that there are potentially remains there. That was the extent of it. And we use the word potential because it's accurate, but we also use the word potential because if people read Mr. Justice Marchand's decision, and it's paragraph 52, 53 is really where he gets into it. He points out, because what the context is that one of his Supreme Court, so one level below him, one of his Supreme Court judges had used the word potential. The litigants in front of her did not like that. They appealed her and, among other things, alleged bias on her behalf because she had used the word potential. That may not have been the only reason why, but that was one of the reasons why. And so Mr. Justice Marchand had to deal with whether or not this judge had, in fact, showed bias by using the word potential. That was the context. And his response was to say, well, here are a litany of Indigenous groups who themselves, in reference to unmarked burial sites around the country, have referred to them as potential. And in fact, the Kamloops band, I believe, at one point had used the word potential as well, or others had used the word potential in reference to the very Kamloops site that is the subject of our resolution. So he said that, and he could have said a lot in his judgment about that suggested that he didn't think that word was appropriate. He didn't say that. And I think a fair reading of the judgment is that he was citing the use of that word approvingly, probably because so many Indigenous groups themselves had used it. So our perspective on that was that if it's good enough for the Indigenous Chief Justice of this province from Kamloops, who probably knows a thing or two about that circumstance, then it ought to be good enough for the lawyers in a cultural competency course that's mandatory.
Now, you had some pushback from various corners. The Law Society issued a statement, said it didn't reflect its views. Then there was the BC First Nations Justice Council. There were academics and politicians that weighed in as well. What was your reaction to that?
Certainly, I anticipated some pushback. It's people have different views on these things. And that's kind of the point, is that we're lawyers. We're supposed to be able to debate, discuss, identify things that we think need to be fixed. Someone else comes along and says, "Don't think so," and we can have a discussion about that. I was surprised and disappointed to see that my own professional regulator saw fit to comment in the way that it did. It started out by suggesting quite strongly, if not outright coming out and saying, that the resolution was vexatious and frivolous, I think was the other word. They also, at the end of their statement, which remains, it was a press release, I think, too, it remains on their website for anyone to see, and it names us both. At the end of it, they indicated that the resolution was a good reminder of a number of things. And the last thing it was a reminder of is the need to root out racism in the profession. Well, I certainly didn't expect that my own regulator would call me a racist or a denialist for what was within the four corners of this particular resolution. In fact, we drafted it very precisely to try our best to avoid the more expansive discussion of all of these different issues. Because really, this particular motion, it's not about Indigenous matters, really. It's about the fact that training materials should be accurate when we're training lawyers in our society. That's really the point. This could have been about any mandatory training subject, and the point would still have been the same. If you've got something in there that is clearly not true, we should be correcting that.
And it hasn't really stopped. There's a bill that was tabled in the House of Commons by an NDP MP to criminalize what's called denialism. What is your reaction to this?
You get into a more general discussion about free speech and where the line should be on that, and that's, we could talk for hours about that topic generally. But with respect to the particular bill, I've not seen it yet. I think it hit today, so I've seen a couple of brief media reports about it. I think that it's a part of a worrying trend in our society, that people who don't agree with what somebody else says seek to muzzle the person that has a different view. And I think that that's just not who we are as Canadians. I think a lot of people died in a couple of world wars at least, including Indigenous people, by the way. A lot of people died for our right to say what we think and basically have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, all of that stuff. And I think those are important values. And the hell of it is that with respect to our resolution, and we were allowed to speak for 3 minutes during the meeting. And part of what I said is that, I actually believe it's quite likely that across Canada there are unmarked graves, just because of what we know about the residential schools, how many there were, how long they were operational for. I think in a general sense, it is quite likely that there are unmarked graves of children that went to the residential schools. I believe that. I think it's quite likely. It doesn't mean that the statement that remains have been found in Kamloops at that particular site is accurate. I also believe that intergenerational trauma is a real thing. I've been a lawyer for 22 years. Most of that's been spent in criminal courts. I have had well over 100 Indigenous clients. I have seen the effects of intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people with my own eyes. I've dealt with those clients who are, no fair-minded person could say that that's not a real thing. It is. So to answer your question about the free speech and the motion, it's distressing that people would go to that extreme end, because I actually think what we need to do more of in this country is talk to each other. I actually think that rather than saying you can't say that, you can't do that, this is just bad, why aren't we sitting down and listening to each other? I'm certainly prepared to sit down and listen to Indigenous individuals who are quite upset about the motion and that we made, and hear why it is that that it was so distressing to them. I don't know. It's not, I'm a white man. It's not my quote unquote lived experience, but it is theirs. But I think that we have to talk to each other. And I think that's the best way that we achieve true reconciliation, is by sharing each other's perspectives, thinking about the other's perspective, going away and saying, okay, you know what? Didn't realize that, didn't kind of see it that way. That's what they meant. That's what they were really saying. Okay, well, that actually makes some sense. Dialogue is how we get there. Passing a bill that says can't say X, absent something that's truly hate speech, I don't think that's the right approach.
That was my guest, Burnaby lawyer Mark Barry. If you are a residential school survivor in crisis, someone is available to speak with you now, anytime, at 1-866-925-4419. That's 1-866-925-4419. And if you think a child or youth under age 19 is being abused or neglected, you have the legal duty to report your concern to a child protection worker. Phone 1-800-663-9122. That's 1-800-663-9122 anytime. It's time on the theBreaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In Kyoto news, China releases images of test-fired ICBM likely to be Dongfeng 31. China's second publicized intercontinental ballistic missile launch into the Pacific Ocean on September 25th, since a successful test firing in May 1980, has sparked speculation that it may be sending a signal to the United States and its allies amid rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Taiwan condemned the launch. The missile is capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. In Kyoto news, China releases images of test-fired ICBM likely to be Dongfeng 31. China's second publicized intercontinental ballistic missile launch into the Pacific Ocean on September 25th, since a successful test firing in May 1980, has sparked speculation that it may be sending a signal to the United States and its allies amid rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Taiwan condemned the launch. The missile is capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. In ABC News, Australia, sea level rise inevitable for Pacific Islands despite future greenhouse gas emissions reduction, NASA finds. The analysis projects a significant increase in flooding in low-lying nations like Tuvalu and Kiribati by the 2050s. Experts predict at least 20 centimeters of sea level rise. Experts say they plan to build more high-resolution maps for more Pacific Island countries in the near future to support mitigation efforts. Sea level rise differs due to global and local conditions, coastal topography, and how glacial meltwater is distributed in the ocean. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. It's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In Willamette Week, illicit massage parlors that profit from sex trafficking are multiplying around the city. No one stops them. Experts say that behind the quiet exteriors are victimized women who often have no choice in their occupation or the means to escape it. In 2019, according to data from a nonprofit that combats human trafficking, Portland had 36 of what it calls illicit massage parlors. 5 years later, the watchdog says the number has tripled to at least 114. High-profile busts this year in Lake Oswego and Newburgh, but not yet in Portland. In Crosscut, Climate Pledge Arena to pay over $477,000 to settle hidden fees case. The cashless venue, since it reopened under its current name in 2021, added a 3% operational fee to food and beverage purchases, according to the Attorney General's office. This undisclosed fee was added to roughly 183,000 purchases at 37 arena events in 2023. The AG's office says the lack of adequate disclosure violates Washington's Consumer Protection Act. And in theBreaker.news, read these stories. NDP Housing Minister and sister targeted in complaint to lobbyist registrar. And key poll in late 2023 set the stage for NDP 2024 election campaign. Read the stories behind these headlines at theBreaker.news and introducing BobMackin.substack.com. Come visit me there too. That's Cascadia calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone. You won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo Bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to families, big and small families. It is National Family Week from September 30th to October 6th. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo Bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of September 29th, 2024. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 29th of September in 2004, 20 years ago, asteroid 4179 Tuteti passed within 4 lunar distances of Earth? Phew, close call. Now you know. Send me your feedback, send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. And introducing BobMackin.substack.com. Visit me there too. And you can also sign up for the free email newsletter and get updates to your inbox, or follow The Breaker News as news happens on X, formerly Twitter. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. That's patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Until next week.